Philosopher King. Isn't that an interesting contradiction? Because if you think about it, philosophers are supposed to sit around and think and debate with each other, and not run cities or states. And kings, well, history doesn't exactly overflow with examples of wise and selfless rulers. But for Plato, this combination wasn't just like an interesting idea. It was actually the only way to guarantee a just and stable society. And he didn't arrive at this conclusion by mere accident. This actually came out of a lifetime of watching politics fail, of seeing how easily a city can be swayed by charm and rhetoric. And most importantly, this idea came out of losing the one person he thought could truly guide it to its conclusion. So in the following couple of videos, we are going to work our way back through Plato's world, so you can actually understand exactly how he reached the ideal of the Philosopher King. And we'll start with the Athens he knew, which at that time was a city that had just lost a devastating war. It was a city that was politically unstable, and where power often belonged to the best speaker, and not to the wisest mind. We'll then look at the rise of the Sophists, who taught that persuasion mattered more than actual truth. We'll also talk about Socrates, the man who pushed back against this way of thinking, and we'll see how his trial and his death, or execution, left Plato convinced that democracy, if it is unguided by real knowledge, was doomed to fail. Then, in later episodes, we'll also unpack Plato's more complicated ideas. We'll go over the theory of forms, we'll go over the form of the good, and the three famous metaphors that are found in the Republic, which is the sun, the divided line, and the cave. So, by the time we actually reach the ideal of the Philosopher King, you won't just know what the ideal is, you'll actually understand why Plato thought that it was the only answer to the question that essentially haunted him since he was 28 years old. It is the question of how a city can ensure that it is ruled by wisdom and not by ignorance or pure ambition. Now, this first episode is the starting point. We are going to take a look at Athens at its moment of crisis, when its democracy was both brilliant but also dangerously unstable at the same time. Now, when most people picture Athens or think about Athens during that time, they think of marble temples, beautiful statues, a gigantic theater, and a bunch of philosophers walking around in togas debating ideas. And all of this was still somewhat true and there during the 5th century BCE. But by the time Plato was a young man, the city was now actually carrying some very deep wounds. Because it is about this time that the Peloponnesian War had finally concluded. And if you know your history, you'll know that it hadn't really ended well for Athens. This war wasn't a quick or glorious fight. It actually lasted almost 30 years, and it was marked by an on and off conflict against Sparta and its allies. And it basically drained the city dry. So by the end of it, in 404 BCE, Athens has lost its empire, it has lost its navy, and it has lost almost all of its walls, and Sparta had literally torn down the long wall that connected the city to its port. It has essentially taken away Athens' control of the seas and forced a humiliating peace term on it. And at the same time, the money from Athens' subject cities also stopped flowing in, and trade became essentially very shaky, which of course meant that the whole economy also suffered. But besides all of this, the real damage wasn't really material or just economic. The real damage was psychological on Athens, because up until this point, Athens had always seen itself as the leader of the Greek world. It saw itself as almost untouchable. But now, it had been beaten, it had been humiliated, and it had been forced to face the fact that it wasn't invincible after all. Now, in terms of the political system of the city during this time, Athens was run by direct democracy, which meant that the citizens didn't just vote for their leaders. They actually made the decisions themselves in the assembly. And in theory, That all sounds like the ultimate form of self-rule, and it did give people a sense of ownership over their own destiny and their city and their politics. But in practice, this was often pretty messy and unpredictable. There was basically no fixed constitution holding things together steadily, so policies could end up flipping from one extreme to another extreme depending on the mood of the crowd and depending on who was actually speaking that day. One single persuasive speech could literally send the whole navy fleet off to war in some foreign land, while another persuasive speech can then completely reverse the decision and call the navy back the very next week, which is of course not ideal. Now, if you compare that to, for example, the current American system, you can see how modern democracies have tried to avoid this kind of volatility. The US is a representative democracy, right? It is built on a written constitution, which acts as a permanent framework or a guardrail. The citizens, in theory, elect their lawmakers to make decisions on their behalf through fair and transparent elections, and those lawmakers then are bound by a set of constitutional limits that cannot simply be overturned by a majority vote in any single moment. On top of that, the separation of powers, so the separation between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government make it even harder for sudden swings in public opinion to instantly change the overall policy. In other words, there is a deliberate buffer between raw public mood or populist mood and the actual machinery of government. Now, these days, the most comparable system to the Athenian system is the Swiss system. But while it is somewhat similar on the surface, the exact mechanism is completely different. Switzerland does have a strong element of direct democracy, with citizens actually voting several times a year on referendums and initiatives that can shape laws directly. But unlike ancient Athens, those votes happen within a constitutional structure that actually sets boundaries and also requires that these proposals that are voted on are formally drafted and reviewed before they are presented to the public. And there's also a federal system, meaning that the decisions are spread across cantons rather than just concentrated in a single assembly. In other words, the Swiss system slows things down considerably and forces decisions to be filtered through multiple layers before they can actually be put on for the citizenry to vote. But Athens, by contrast, had almost none of these safeguards. The assembly could literally vote in the morning, and the result could be acted on later that evening. That speed could obviously be a strength in times of crisis or war, but it also meant that the city was always one impassioned speech away from a complete policy reversal. And Athens loved speeches. To them, oratory, or the skill of oratory, was basically an art form, and the man who could move a crowd could essentially move policy, which basically meant that the most valuable skill in politics during that time wasn't necessarily wisdom or experience. It was just pure persuasion. If you could speak well, you could lead, whether or not your ideas were actually sound, which is not all too different from what we currently have if you think about it for a second. In any case, this political reality is exactly why the Sophists were extremely influential during that time. Now, the Sophists were basically professional teachers, and what they taught was the skill ambitious young men needed to get ahead, which was how to argue persuasively, how to win debates, and even how to make the weaker argument look stronger on the surface. For the Sophists, truth wasn't really fixed and that important. For them, truth was more like something that you could shape, depending on exactly what you wanted to achieve. For them, truth was essentially an instrument. And in a city where words or a good speech could influence policy, that approach wasn't just useful, it was the direct path to political power. And this in turn shaped the entire political climate in the city. The question really stopped being, what is the right thing to do here? What is the just thing to do here? And actually became, what can I make people believe is true and agree to? And the war itself, it of course only made this problem worse. As you can imagine, long conflicts exhaust people. It makes them impatient, and it makes them more likely to take big risks just to end all of this uncertainty. So during the Peloponnesian War, Athens basically saw moments of extreme instability and political volatility. There were short-lived oligarchic coups, there were sudden restorations of democracy, there were erratic changes in leadership, and there were also just constant factional struggles. So by the time the war itself was over, the city wasn't just militarily or economically weaker, it was actually politically completely on the edge. Which means that during this time, the city was quick to turn on itself, and it was also easily swayed by whatever argument promised security or advantage in the short term. In other words, the city was basically ruled by populists. So this is the Athens Plato grew up in. He grew up in a city that on paper gave every single citizen a voice, but in practice it usually only rewarded the man who could speak the loudest or provoke the strongest emotions in a crowd. He saw a political system that was built on the promise of collective wisdom slowly twist into one where actual leadership often went not to the most capable, the wisest, or the most just, but to the most convincing performer. He saw decisions that were made on Monday be reversed on Wednesday, and not because the new evidence had suddenly come to light or because those decisions were deemed wrong objectively. No, they were reversed because one talented speaker had now managed to turn the crowd. And he also saw that these erratic swings weren't always harmless, because often than not, they actually led to decisions that were not only reckless, but in some cases deeply unjust. And to Plato, this wasn't just a small flaw or a small blip in the system. This was a structural weakness because the health of the city depended on the changing mood of the assembly and the crowd. And if that mood could be turned by rhetoric alone or by a charming speaker alone, then the city's fate rested on something unstable by nature. And in his lifetime, that instability wasn't just theoretical. He would actually see it lead to disastrous military campaigns, see it lead to cycles of revenge between democratic and oligarchic factions, and ultimately, it will lead to the trial and execution of the man he believed was the most just citizen Athens ever produced. So, every idea he develops thereafter, and every argument of his that concerns justice, knowledge, and leadership is rooted in this experience of watching his own city fail to live up to its own ideals. And when we later talk about Socrates and Plato's theory of knowledge, and finally about the ideal of the philosopher king, you'll see that these aren't just the dreams of some crazy person that is detached from reality. This is the response of a man who had already decided, based on what he'd seen with his own eyes, that the political system he lived in couldn't be trusted to guide itself. Because without a standard or a constitution that is higher than the public opinion, the crowd could be swayed. And when the crowd could be swayed, justice will inevitably be lost. Right. So, in the next episode, we'll talk about Socrates himself, and not just about the man who stood at the center of Plato's world. We'll talk about the way he lived, the way he questioned his fellow citizens, and why his method was so disruptive to the political culture in Athens during that time. We will understand why his relentless search for definitions wasn't just a game or just a performance, but actually the direct challenge to the way the city made decisions, and why that challenge ultimately cost him his life.